What's going on, Packers fans? Aaron Nagler here, chatting it up with Justis for another edition of what the hell's going on with DK Metcalf and the Packers? I mean, at this point, Justis, I see you arguing with people on Twitter. That's so unlike you. That's my job. That you're trying to steal my gig here, man. Uh, what's going on as far as, we've reached the point now where last time we talked, this was all theoretical, but now DK Metcalf has reportedly indeed asked for a trade. And the Packers are certainly in need of wide receiver help. I do see lots of names bandied about, whether it's Devontae Adams, even a few other guys that have been thrown into the mix as far as potential free agent acquisitions. But you seem hell-bent on this DK Metcalf acquisition.
I think he just makes the most sense out of all the players out there. Again, so Front Street, something I believe, and I believe this is necessary to understand why DK would be considered so highly. The only man beater on the team was Christian Watson. Jaden Reed ranked something like 86th in receiving yards over the last 2 years against man coverage. You could look at all the metrics, the yards per route ran stuff. His efficiency's cut in half when he's running against zone versus when he's running against man. So fundamentally, the Packers wide receiver room has to be shaped around the deficiencies of Jaden Reed's game. And I know a lot of people will listen to this, and that's probably not what they want to hear. And they just hope line goes up and player just keeps getting better. And, you +1, +2 attributes every single year like you do in Madden, right?
Right. And everybody just is, literally getting better.
Right.
Absolutely.
But that's not how this worked. So the team fundamentally needs to do to replace Watson is add some speed. Some sort of guy who can take the top off of defense, make you pay either a man coverage or cover two, right? Where there's, holes in deeper zones on the field. And the thing with Matt is looking for a very specific type of wide receiver in general. Once you look at his size, right? He's looking at guys who are 6 foot, 200, and really it's closer to 200, 210 than it is 200.
And that has traditionally been what type that Green Bay gravitates to anyway. Like that has, going back 30 years, right? When Ron Wolf came in the door, that has been the body type that they've defaulted to more often than not, or they've tried to.
Right. So I think when people look at the combine and stuff and they're like, well, there's a bunch of receivers who are out there. Like, we can go grab these guys. And
they run real fast.
Yeah. And they're like, this guy who's, this guy's 195 because he bulked up for Indianapolis. And that's pretty close to 200. And I'm like, no, these guys got to be closer to 210 than they are 200, honestly. Yeah. That's what this offense is looking for. And if you want an example of why you need that, look at the Eagles game where they couldn't run the ball because you have Jaden Reed and Bo Melton out there and you can't have two smalls. Right?
Yeah.
Jaden Reed for the foreseeable future is your designated small. That's the decision this team has made. Everyone else around him has to be big.
Especially when you look at the way he's utilized, almost like Tyler Ervin was back when LaFleur first got to Green Bay, right? Like, I think he's obviously a bit more dynamic as a receiver. Clearly downfield, he can do a lot more, but that is maybe not his sole function, but that is his primary function in this offense. There's no doubt about that.
Right. So you look at the draft, right? I guess we could start with free agency. There's a lot of wide receivers out there. Outside of maybe Godwin, maybe Devontae, depending what you think of Devontae. I don't think he's take the top off the defense, but his release package,
even at his height of his powers, he wasn't bad.
But his release package is good enough that I think he could beat man coverage in ways that can make defenses pay. But outside of those two guys, all the other receivers that people bandy about, you're either too small or you're definitely not fast enough to kind of fill out that role. You look at the draft, we just had, not everyone ran, but a lot of people ran. I think you could probably add guys like Taratora, McMillan, and Emeka Egbuka on this list once they eventually run. But if you're looking at guys who are Packer sized, guys who ran 4.4s who actually have that deep speed, guys who are actually going to play on the outside and not the slot, which again is going to be very important because of the Jaden Reed context. So, a guy like a Luther Burden or a Jalen Royals, right, from Utah State, I think those guys are going to primarily play in the slot at the NFL level. So you're looking at the draft and you're like, okay, what do we have as far as options in the top 100. And like I mentioned, like McMillan, Egbuka, those guys make sense. And I think, once they run, they'll check out as far as that. But the guys who actually ran in Indianapolis, there's two. It's Ayumanor from Stanford, and it's Higgins from Iowa State.
Higgins is the one guy I'm really hoping they get out of this draft, which means they never will. But that is, I mean, to your point though, he was made in a lab to be a Packer.
Yeah,
like 100%. Like that is a guy who, man, if they got out of day 2 with him on board, with whatever else they do prior to the draft, then I think they're cooking with gas. But to your point, he's to me the shining kind of star as far as potential Packers in this draft class at wide receiver.
But who knows? I mean, with a bad free agency class and all that stuff, and people are talking, it's relatively weak on the top end too. Like, how high does Higgins go? I mean, is that a guy who ends up going in the first round? You never have a chance to get him. So the Packers are in a spot right now. You're really threading the need. There's not that many guys who are going to fill, which is why a Christian Watson goes high second round. You trade up, you give up 2 second-round picks for him, right? There's not that many guys who can fill that role, and one of them is DK. And that's why DK makes sense. Now, as far as the compensation and stuff like that, I think Seattle in general I think they kind of subscribe to the same theory that Goot talked about, where he was like, hey, he mentioned this in a press conference. I can't remember if it was the end of the year one, where he basically said, like, if you have a number 1 wide receiver and all you do is feed that number 1 wide receiver, those teams don't end up panning out very well.
It was the end of the season press conference,
right?
That's when you talked about it. Yeah.
And I think the Packers are in a good spot in terms of just like having bodies across the board that they can throw to. I mean, Tucker Kraft, all that stuff. Mary mentioned Jaden Reed, Romeo Doubs, Wicks, right? Like they have guys that they can throw to.
And who knows what you get from Musgrave if he ever is able to stay on the field,
But I think Seattle's kind of in the same spot. And, they just got rid of Lockett. They spent a first-round pick on JSN. They had DK. I mean, they spent more at wide receiver than anyone in the league, just in terms of like raw assets. I don't know about the money, but raw assets, right? And now it seems like they realized that didn't really work for them, and they want to turn a page. And in the same vein, right, I think Schneider is probably looking at this and is like, we didn't make the playoffs last year. All we did was make a change at offensive coordinator. Do we now give DK $30 million a year and just like continue to run it back, or do we try to adjust in some sort of way? And I think that's probably the root core of DK not getting his money, which there's no doubt that has something to play in this right now. Like if DK was paid, there's not the weeks-long conversations that, Schefter and Rappaport and all those guys have reported. Like if he's just like, hey, here's, 3 years, $90 million, you're under contract.
Yeah,
no problem.
It cuts off a lot of this, no doubt.
So I think it's going to get interesting because from my understanding, most of the reporting is right. Tyler, don't clip this up. I want to see this on my Twitter feed. This is for the Cheesehead TV YouTube only.
Yeah, no worries. No worries about that.
From my understanding, the Seahawks asking price of a first-round pick and a third-round pick is correct. And the response, which that came from Diana Rossini, the response, which Josina Anderson has reported on a couple times, is basically like, yeah, they got an offer for it with like a third and some other stuff, but that's kind of it. And the team that offered, one of the teams at least, that offered the third kind of like walked away, at least momentarily, and is like, all right, let me know when you guys are being serious.
Yep, exactly, right.
So I think that makes a lot of sense in the context of the Packers. I mean, I could totally see this team willing to give up a third and maybe like a Romeo Doubs, I think, is the one that makes the most sense. Expiring contract. Christian Watson's the other expiring contract, but you can't really get.
You're not going to trade him while he's hurt.
Yeah, exactly. Happen. So I think Doubs makes the most sense. Plus, West Coast, all that stuff. Probably a better chance of retaining him on a contract and all that stuff. What's interesting to me is people are like, well, third round pick and Romeo Doubs, that's not enough. So he'll just play for the Seahawks this year. First of all, these holdouts are very painful for teams.
Yes.
And the players win almost
100% of the time. Talk to Ayuk, talk to TJ Watt, talk to any of the guys who recent vintage since they, have started the hold ins because they don't want
Le'Veon Bell sat out
the fines to
like a
accrue.
year.
So they win more often than not.
Yes,
that is correct.
So here is the painful reality that the Seahawks are dealing with right now, right? They basically have a $30 million cap hold on their salary cap situation going into free agency. The cap bump that everyone talked about, where people were like, "Yo, hey, $25 million more than what we expected." That really bailed out the Seahawks. If they didn't have that, DK almost certainly is getting moved before the new league year starts. They're in a position now where if they don't really want to be active in free agency, they can kind of sit on DK for a little bit. But even John Schneider mentioned that like the deadline for something to get done is the draft. And I think that makes a lot of sense because I think that shows they're not willing to pay DK, first of all, which huge point of leverage that gets off of the table, right? Because the reason that you wouldn't be looking post-draft is because you are already due a compensatory pick if he walks in free agency the following year. If DK walks, he's only going to get him a compensatory third. A third-round pick from Green Bay this year instead of 2027
helps you a hell of a lot sooner.
Plus Romeo Doubs is better than that draft
package.
Pick right
certainly injects life into your transition, as it were.
Second of all,
no doubt,
if DK gets tagged, that's like because he already has a $30 million cap hit. That's $38 million because it's 120% of your last cap hit, or it's whatever the average of the top five.
Average of the top five,
and whichever one is higher. That's not a team that can afford to have a $38 million cap hold going into the 2026 offseason. That's not something that they're going to be able to do. So when people are like, well, hey, look, the asking price is just too, like, they're going to have to do something.
Yes.
It clearly did not go well. I mean, all the reporting from the day of the demand of the trade where it was, hey, Tyler Lockett is retiring, and then 20 minutes later, DK asked to trade, and everyone is like, today was supposed to be about Tyler Lockett, and DK made this about him. That making a mess, that's the leverage that the players have.
We're like, and the other thing is that's just the beginning. Like, that's literally just kicking it off.
It is March 7th.
Yeah. Long way. A lot of ball game left.
Yes. So, yeah, man, like a lot of stuff can happen. I mean, even look at the Myles Garrett thing where everyone almost consensusly, right, was like, man, that is a brutal trade request for Cleveland. Myles would really have to commit to making a mess to get out of there. He spent the better part of the last month. I know you were down there at the Super Bowl. You must have seen Myles Garrett walking around Radio Row talking to every single person who had a microphone.
Yes, sir.
I think the past day, man, I'm spacing out on her name. She used to be the NFL Network reporter who used to go through Cleveland and Pittsburgh and stuff a lot. I'm spacing on her name. Yep. So she just reported like a big thing, and Myles Garrett's dealing with his foot injury. Maybe he has season-ending foot surgery that he didn't deal with this past year, and he just collects his money and just hangs out on the Browns' bench. Maybe he retires and just starts doing like anime for like a year, and then comes back to football. Like
Mike Daniels.
these players have more power than you think. Like if they want to make a mess, they'll drag you and the franchise through the dirt to get what they want. So
the flip side there, of course, for the Browns especially, is like what they're already. I mean, they can't be much more in the dirt after the whole Deshaun Watson thing and everything they're dealing with. That, of course, that muddies the waters for the whole Garrett situation. Right. And I do appreciate the reporting there, where it's like, oh yeah, just happens to come out that he requested a meeting with the owner, and the owner said, "Nah, I'm good." I mean, it's only going to get worse on that regard. But spinning it back to DK. Here's my question for you, because you have been driving this train, right? And I completely understand what you're talking about. And I don't think I've seen you go back and forth with some people today on Twitter. And what I don't think people understand is, and this is something we talked about here on Packers Daily a couple days ago, it's not just you need receiver help. You need a certain type for this offense. And you do not have to look much further than the last two iterations, whether it was MVS back with Rodgers or Christian Watson now with Jordan Love, where when one of those guys has gone down, they are the same type and or style of receiver on the perimeter that really opens things up, has the defensive coordinator having to address you in a very different way as far as what he's trying to roll coverage to, what he's worried about down in and down out about you taking the top off, etc. All of that has disappeared, and you saw that materialize 100% in the playoff game, where
Well, even against Minnesota, right, where they were going
right,
against
well, without
Minnesota,
Watson, right,
right, and they were like, "Hey, we were seeing a whole lot more man than what we expected, and we just like never adjusted to it." And the defense is just choking you out coverage
with a
wise.
too high safety look for 80% of the time, and you're just
Right.
working.
And that's what we could be
happened
seeing
against
for an
Philly,
entire
too.
season. That's what
Yes.
the people were like, well, you don't need a guy who's fast. Yes.
Yeah, you
Yes,
do.
we so desperately need a guy that is fast.
And it can't just be because everyone always automatically goes to Bo Melton. And God bless him. I love Bo.
They cannot run the
that
ball
guy.
no.
They
And
can't
that's
run
the
it
other
with
thing.
him. And also, he can't outmuscle people at the point of attack
Yes.
downfield. That's not his
Yeah.
game at all.
He's 5'11.
You know?
He's like 180 something. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, at a certain point, like this is an analogy. I can barely get the word out of my mouth. English is my second language.
Right.
This is an analogy a lot of people say when it comes to like draft stuff. So I don't know how much crossover this is, but like people talk about wide receiver units as like basketball teams, right? And what the Packers need more desperately than anything is like they need that athletic power forward. Like they need that athletic power forward. They got the other stuff, right? Like Jaden Reed is going to be your little guard, all that stuff. And they need that body specifically to make this thing work. And I know that might be annoying. That's how this offense works. Look at, I mean, the Jets that were just running that offense, right? Like they brought in Lazard, they brought in Devontae Adams. They brought in Lazard before they even knew if Rodgers was coming.
If Rodgers was coming, or officially coming. Anyway.
Garrett Wilson was the small guy there, by the way.
Right.
That's their read in this version. You look at San Francisco with what Kyle Shanahan does. All of those guys are bigger than you think. Ayuk is bigger than you think. Deebo Samuel, I mean,
Big guy.
Yeah, he's a thick guy.
It's funny though because in that offense he's the read, like he was. Now he's in Washington, but that was his role,
right?
You know?
Los Angeles, Cooper Kupp is way bigger than anyone thinks. Like that dude is legit 6'3", and he might be like 210.
Right.
So like that's how this offense works. It demands those bodies. It's the reason why the Xavier Worthies aren't playing in these systems. They're playing in Kansas City and stuff like that. So something worth thinking about.
Here's my question for you, because this is how I think this is going to go down. And I don't mean to throw a wet blanket on everything, but it's kind of what I do. I suspect someone will outbid the Packers. I am ready for it. You know, I mean, I think as usual, the Packers will be in the mix. And I do not doubt for a moment that they're going to offer what they can or what they feel is fair. And then, as Brian has said many times, in particular right here on Cheese at TV, you got to have a walk away point. And I think they'll meet their walk away point, you know?
Well, that's what the Josina Anderson stuff is really interesting because I'm like,
that sounds like the Packers.
Again, from my understanding of things, I'm not reporting anything. Tyler, do not clip this up.
Love it.
That team is acting a whole lot like what the Packers would
act like. Exactly. Right. No doubt about it. But, you know, so here's my question to you, Justis, you of the DK train that you are the conductor of, and that falls apart, goes off the rails, completely bites the dust as he becomes a Charger, let's say.
That's the team that I'm worried about.
You should be. That's 100% should be. So here's my question to you as a Packers fan. Are you excited at the prospect of seeing a reunion that is not Devontae Adams, but is MVS?
We talked about it, and I actually wrote it for a couple weeks ago. I had like an outline after I'd kind of gone through free agency and looked a little bit at the draft, and I'm like outlining what a Packers offseason can look like. And I think the first bullet point I had, and this was before any of the DK stuff came out in public, right. And it was call the Seahawks about DK until they tell you no, and then sign MVS. Yeah. That was my answer at receiver going into the draft.
It's everything we're talking about as far as a guy on the perimeter who can worry a defensive coordinator as far as how he's got to play him, but also MVS is a dog in the run game. Like people may not remember.
He also played he played some decent football with some bad quarterbacks.
With some real bad quarterbacks in New Orleans. That's what I've been saying. No one wants to hear it, but I think that's way more likely than a Devontae Adams.
I don't think he's going to get like $5 million. Like he's going to get maybe the Isaiah McDuffie contract, but like it'll be like a 1-year deal too. Like it's not going to be.
Well, and that's the other thing. You only need him for 1 year. You need to plug him in this season in particular because
Christian's dad said he's coming back week 12.
Week 12, baby. I got to circle on the calendar. No, but that's my trying to be a realist about this.
Yeah,
especially if they make a swing, say an edge rusher or a corner in free agency. That's, I think, way more likely than landing DK or Devontae or anything like that.
I think it'll be considered. Because I mean, really the three positions I would look at for the Packers. How do we phrase it? Like pre-draft? Is that fair? Pre-draft?
Pre-draft visit? Yep.
Yeah. Well, just
or
like
pre-draft work.
Trade
Sure.
and free agency.
Yep.
The defensive tackle draft is deep enough that I think they'll probably want to address it there. Especially with, you still have Devontae on a 1-year deal, right? But I think they would look at corner. I think the names to pay attention there specifically are like Byron Murphy and Paulson Adebo. I think it was Rob Demovsky reported that
had them in the Reed sweepstakes.
DJ Reed.
Yeah.
That would be a little surprising to me because he's a smaller cornerback. And I mean, I think
they got plenty of small on offer already in that room,
Well, I think they still got a photo of like Ahmad Carroll hanging up in the front office.
Stop. I can't. His boxing gloves hung right next to them too. right next to that picture.
So I think cornerback is one where there's at least a couple options where they could swing big. Edge rusher, there's plenty of talent out there. I mean,
yes,
there's no reason for them not to come away with an edge rusher.
Totally agree.
I mean, at worst, you can get like a Chase Young, former 2nd overall pick, done pretty well in the NFL, and he played for Halfley, right?
Yep.
At Ohio State.
Yep.
And then wide receiver, I think you're probably looking at very specific players. I think it'd be, DK, Devontae, and then once you get to that point, you're like MVS in terms of scheme fit and how much he would cost. Like that makes a lot of sense.
He makes all the sense in the world because he allows you to do anything else you want. But also, it's if you're bringing in. I saw someone talking about Kirk being traded to wherever you got to the Texans, and why weren't the Packers in on that? Why would the Packers be in on that?
He can't block.
100. A, he can't block, but B, he's a type you've already got.
Yeah,
plenty of. Man.
I don't know what the heck he's gonna. Because one, he plays in the slot. He doesn't block. He's going to be playing in that system, and he's not a super fast guy like that. Honestly, that's a horrendous skill fit.
I can't even remember. Who's their new coordinator?
Their new coordinator came from the Rams.
That's right.
I can't remember his name.
I can't remember his name, but I remember that.
Because the Texans swung and missed on Chip.
That's right.
Yeah.
Chip Kelly. Amazing. Well, Justis, what's fascinating is that the next time we speak, there will have actually been things happening in free agency. And hopefully, the Packers will be involved in some of it, or maybe even pull the trigger on a trade for DK Metcalf.
Well, did you see the big news? It broke while we were on here.
What's that? What's the big news?
Jonathan Ford tendered by the Chicago Bears.
Packers legend.
Did Gutterball miss again on a draft pick? Gutterball giving other teams in the division talent. How dare he?
It's like Hunter Hillenmeyer back in the day. Mike Sherman cut him too loose too early, man. Can't be doing it. Cannot be doing it. All right, Justis, I really appreciate the time, man. We'll talk to you next week.
Yes, sir. Whenever you need me.